I was 16, and my father insisted we travel back to his old village in Maharashtra. My grandmother had passed, and my father was dead set on performing her last rites himself, in the house he'd grown up in. The village elders warned it wasn't wise. Too much time had passed, they said. They didn't have to say it. I could see they were afraid. The house itself was like something out of a fever dream. Shadowy halls, walls streaked with damp. As soon as we crossed the threshold, something seemed to settle over us. The stale weight of pain, still alive in those walls. We barely slept that night, as the storm raged outside. The next day, my father began the preparations. He muttered about how honoring his mother would bring her peace, maybe even a little solace for himself. I remembered things he had told me about her. How she raised him with rules so strict they didn't make sense to anyone but her. He once let slip that she'd lock him up alone in a storage room for hours if he made mistakes, or worse. He wouldn't say more, but his voice got so tight every time he mentioned her. All those old punishments, they left marks on him. And that night, I could see it on his face, a strange mix of fear and obedience, like he was still her little boy. By nightfall, a storm was building outside, and the elders arrived with items for the ritual. I noticed the tightness in their expressions, the way they avoided looking at each other. They weren't there to honor my grandmother. They were there because my father had paid them handsomely. One elder leaned close to my father, muttering about how he shouldn't invite her back. But he stopped when my father gave him a sharp look. As midnight approached, we gathered in the largest room. A sacred circle filled with mystic patterns had been drawn on the floor with colored flour, the vibrant powder tracing an unbroken boundary meant to keep the spirits at bay. My father set candles around the pattern and lit each one with trembling hands. Then he started to chant from a leather-bound ancient book. The elders reluctantly added their voice to his. With each word he spoke, a cold heaviness settled over the room. There was this smell, too, like something long buried rising to the surface. And just as my father poured the last of the blessed water around the circle, something shifted in the air. I turned to the doorway and froze. Standing there, barely visible in the flickering light, was a figure, an old woman, or something that had mimicked that shape. She didn't step forward. She seemed stuck halfway between here and somewhere far worse. Her face was blurred, twisted, like someone had smeared ink and blood over it. Her hands were red and raw, as if they'd been scraped down to the bone, the flesh torn and peeling in bloodied shreds. And there was someone else with her, a boy, maybe 10 years old, clinging to her. His face was a chalky blur, his mouth open in a scream that made no sound. In his hands, he held a small, battered notebook, pages dark with what looked like ink. Horrified gasps escaped from my father and the elders, their faces pale with shock. The boy's eyes locked onto mine, rooting my feet to the floor, like they'd been fused there. He pointed to the notebook. I focused on the object. It wasn't ink lacing the pages. It was blood. A vision flickered through my mind like an old film reel. The story he'd once told me about the night she'd hit him so hard. Blood spattered across his handwriting practice notebook, staining the careful rows of letters. This apparition was my father's memories brought to life, his terror, his guilt, everything he'd buried, spilling into the room as the ritual tore open the veil between worlds. The boy turned his empty stare on him, and my father's hands started to shake. He chanted louder, the words of prayer a shield against the terror that gaped at him. The sounds of a child being punished with a cane rang through the house. His screams unnerved everyone who was present. Some of the elders abandoned the ritual and ran out of the house, much to my father's chagrin. An invisible spell shattered, and the thing that looked like my grandmother took a step closer, her bloodied hand reaching forward. Her gaze was cold and merciless. It was the look my father must have seen 100 times, the one he'd never escaped. The ghostly boy tugged helplessly to pull her back, but his small hands were no match for her relentless push forward. The boy started at me, and his voice, silent as it was, filled my head. "Stop her," it seemed to say. "Stop her before she takes him with her." Without thinking, I reached out, grabbed a candle, and hurled it into the center of the circle, breaking the fragile lines. The flame flared as it ignited the powder, sending curls of smoke rising from the broken pattern. The now ruined runes pulsed, as though charged with some hidden force. The circle wasn't just broken, it had come alive. The air seemed to crack, and there was a sound, something between a scream and a laugh, high and jagged, that seemed to tear through the room. The spectral shapes twisted, faded, and then they were gone. To this day, I can't say what compelled me to do what I did. In the empty silence that followed, my father was on his knees, clutching his chest, gasping like he'd nearly drowned. Once, he'd been a man haunted, still bound to a dead mother who'd never stopped punishing him. But now, his face lit up, alive with the possibility of a life free from the weight of those painful memories. At dawn, we packed our things and left. He didn't look back, and he hasn't spoken of that night since. But I know it's still there, like a splinter lodged somewhere he can't reach. Sometimes, I see it in the way he flinches at sudden sounds or in his hollow stare on sleepless nights.